The city throbbed with the quiet arrogance of wealth, its glass towers piercing the night sky, sidewalks polished to a mirror, sheen under the sodium glow of streetlights. At its core stood the Hamilton, a sanctum of whispered reservations and velvet exclusivity, where doormen stood like silent sentinels guarding a world of privilege. Luther Grant lingered just outside its entrance, wrapped in a stillness that felt both heavy and serene, a man who had borne the weight of history and emerged unbowed. He'd arrived early, as always, not out of impatience, but a need to anchor himself in the calm before the storm of memory and recognition could catch up. His granddaughter, Claire, was inside, finishing a dinner with Georgetown Law colleagues, an event he'd declined with a gentle smile, his voice steady as he'd said, "Take your time, Claire. I'll be right here." Beneath his composed exterior, a quiet pride flickered. She was carving her own path, and he would not cast a shadow over it. He glanced at the street taxis gliding silently, luxury cars purring to the valet. It had been years since he'd last stood unnoticed, a rare moment where the city's hum drowned out the echoes of his past. A faint ache tugged at his chest, not from regret, but from the bittersweet luxury of anonymity, a gift he'd once taken for granted. Pedestrians brushed past, some casting fleeting, curious glances, their brows furrowing as if his face stirred a distant memory they couldn't grasp. He welcomed their ignorance, savoring the freedom of being just a man in a coat, not a symbol. Across the street, a squad car idled, its engine a low growl cutting through the night's murmur. The two officers inside had been watching him for several minutes, their laughter fading into a tense, unspoken agreement. Luther felt their stares prickling against his skin, a familiar sensation that stirred a quiet resolve deep within him. He'd faced worse, and he would face this too. Officer Jake Roor tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, a restless rhythm betraying the smirk curling his lips. His eyes narrowed as he studied the elderly black man standing alone outside the high-end restaurant, a flicker of disdain tightening his chest. "Look at this guy," he muttered, shaking his head with a forced chuckle that masked a simmering irritation. "They always find their way into places they don't belong." Brent Kincade, older and harder-edged, exhaled through his nose, his jaw clenching as he watched Luther adjust his coat, with a grace that felt like a quiet defiance. A cold knot of resentment coiled in his gut. Men like this, he thought, always acting like they own the world. "I swear they're getting bolder every year," he growled, voice low and bitter. "Bet you anything he's waiting to hit someone up for cash, probably tailing one of these rich folks when they leave." Roar's smirk widened, a spark of cruel amusement lighting his eyes as he shoved the door open. "Guess we better make sure he doesn't get too comfortable." Kincade followed, adjusting his belt with a deliberate tug, his heart thudding with the thrill of control as they crossed the street, their steps slow and heavy with expectation. Luther didn't turn when he heard the footsteps, though a faint tightness gripped his throat, a memory of countless nights like this, where authority came cloaked in contempt. He didn't flinch when Roar's voice cut through, thick with unearned confidence. "Sir, we're going to need you to move along." Luther inhaled deeply, steadying the flicker of weariness that threatened to surface, and turned to face them. Roar's smirk twisted his mouth, his stance loose and mocking. A man reveling in the power he wielded like a toy. Kincade stood rigid, hands on his belt, fingers brushing his baton, his eyes glinting with a quiet, predatory amusement that made Luther's stomach turn, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of seeing it again. He studied them for a long, silent moment, then spoke, his voice smooth and unshaken, though a thread of sorrow wove through it. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter." Roar's smirk stretched, a cruel edge sharpening it as he let out a scoff, his chest swelling with derision. "He said," he drawled, mocking the words as if they were a child's lie. "See, that's the thing. You've been standing here a while, and we've had complaints about suspicious activity. Can't have people loitering outside a nice place like this." Luther held his gaze, unblinking, a quiet anger smoldering beneath his calm. "Suspicious activity," he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they implied. Kincade exhaled sharply, shaking his head, a flare of impatience tightening his grip on his belt. "Just move along, all right? We won't ask twice." Luther didn't move, though a pang of frustration rippled through him, not at them, but at the predictability of it all. He reached into his coat, slow and deliberate, retrieving his wallet with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of decades spent proving himself to men who refused to see. "I assume you'll want to see some identification," he said, voice steady, though a quiet ache pulsed in his chest. Kincade's jaw tightened, irritation flashing in his eyes, but Roor acted first. With a swift, vicious slap, he knocked the wallet from Luther's hand. It hit the pavement with a dull thud, bills and cards scattering like fallen leaves, and a sharp sting of humiliation pierced Luther not for himself, but for the dignity they thought they could strip away. He didn't flinch, though his breath caught for a moment, a tide of resolve surging over the hurt. His expression shifted not to anger, but to a stillness so profound it sent a shiver of unease through Roor's smug facade. Kincade stepped forward, his boot grinding the wallet into the concrete, a deliberate act that twisted Luther's gut with a mix of disgust and pity. "Didn't ask for ID," Kincade muttered, his sneer dripping with contempt. Roor chuckled, a hollow sound that grated against Luther's ears. "You got a problem following directions, old man?" Luther's hands remained at his sides, his posture unyielding, though a quiet grief settled over him for them, for their blindness. He let the moment stretch, their actions sinking into the air like stones in water, then spoke, his voice carrying a certainty that trembled with restrained power. "You are making a mistake." Kincade leaned in, his breath hot and sharp, a flicker of doubt buried beneath his scorn. "Yeah? And what exactly do you think's gonna happen here, huh?" Luther's eyes locked onto his, unflinching, a deep well of patience masking the storm within. "You're going to find out," he said, the words soft but heavy with a sorrowful promise. The air shifted, a thread of unease snaking through their arrogance, but they didn't feel it, not yet. Their hearts beat with the thrill of dominance, blind to the reckoning they'd just summoned. They expected him to crack, to give them the defiance they craved, but Luther had faced men like these before, men who wielded power like a blunt instrument, oblivious to its fragility. He wouldn't feed their game, though a quiet fury simmered beneath his calm, tempered by decades of resilience. Kincade pressed his boot harder into the wallet, a cruel dare that made Luther's chest tighten with a fleeting pang of loss, not for the wallet, but for the innocence he'd once held before the world taught him its rules. "You're not hearing us, old man," Kincade hissed, his sneer sharpening with frustration. Roor stepped closer, his grin widening, a spark of malice lighting his eyes. "See, I don't think you understand how this works. You don't tell us what we can and can't do." Luther exhaled slowly, steadying the flicker of exhaustion that tugged at him, his heart heavy with the weight of their ignorance. "I suggest you rethink what you're about to do," he said, voice quiet, but laced with a mournful certainty. Kincade's smile wavered, a crack in his bravado, but Roor gripped Luther's arm with a sudden yank, twisting it just enough to sting. A jolt of pain shot through Luther's shoulder, but he swallowed it, his resolve hardening like steel. "You suggesting we need a damn permission slip to do our jobs?" Roor snarled, his breath hot with anger. Kincade pressed against Luther's back, forcing him toward the squad car, a rough shove that sent a surge of indignation through him. Not for the act, but for the casual cruelty behind it. "You're making a mistake," Luther said again, the words slow and deliberate, a quiet tremor of defiance threading through them. Roor chuckled, shoving him into the back seat, the sound grating against Luther's ears like a taunt. "Yeah, you keep saying that. But your biggest mistake was not leaving when you had the chance." The door slammed shut, a hollow thud that echoed in Luther's chest, stirring a fleeting wave of isolation, but beneath it, a steady pulse of certainty grew. He wasn't alone for long. Hurried footsteps cracked the stillness, Claire's voice slicing through the night like a blade, sharp with fury and fear. "Get your hands off him!" Her heels clicked against the pavement as she broke into a near run, her breath ragged with disbelief, her heart hammering as she saw her grandfather, her rock, her hero manhandled like a criminal. Roor barely glanced at her, his smirk faltering under her intensity. "Ma'am, step back," Kincade said, his tone bored, dismissive, a flick of his hand that sent a surge of rage through Claire's veins. Her eyes widened, hands trembling as she yanked out her phone, fingers shaking with a mix of terror and resolve. "This is a mistake," she said, voice cracking with urgency, her chest tight with the need to protect him. "That man is Luther Grant. Justice Luther Grant, a retired Supreme Court justice. Do you understand what you're doing? Roar's grip loosened slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but he scoffed, masking it with bravado as he glanced at Kincade. A Supreme Court justice, huh? Kincade chuckled, a cold, hollow sound that twisted Claire's stomach with dread, his hands snapping cuffs over Luther's wrists with unnecessary force. Well, isn't that cute? Claire hit record, camera trained on them, her breath hitching as tears stung her eyes not from weakness, but from the raw, helpless fury of watching them degrade him. "You're making a mistake," she said, voice trembling with the weight of realization, her heart pounding with a fierce, protective love. Roar grinned, shoving Luther deeper into the car. "Funny, that's what he said." The door slammed again, and Claire's vision blurred with a rush of anguish, her hands shaking as she clutched the phone. But through the window, she caught Luther's gaze, calm, composed, unshaken, and a spark of hope pierced her despair. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting, a quiet strength radiating from him that steadied her racing pulse. Inside the squad car, arrogance hung thick, pressing against Luther's skin like the steel cuffs biting his wrists. Roar adjusted the rearview mirror, his grin lazy but edged with a nervous energy he couldn't name, his heart thudding with a mix of triumph and unease. Kincade stretched, glancing back, his voice dripping with a cruelty that masked a flicker of doubt. "You know," he drawled, "you people never learn." Luther didn't react, though a quiet ache pulsed in his chest. He'd heard it too many times, the words a dull knife against his spirit. Roar chuckled, a brittle sound that betrayed the tension coiling in his gut. "What's the play here, huh? Think if you wear the nice coat, stand outside fancy places, you get respect?" Luther met his gaze in the mirror, voice smooth but heavy with a sorrowful weight. "I don't need to earn respect from men like you." Roar laughed, nudging Kincade, but the sound rang hollow, his confidence fraying at the edges. "Oh, we got a classy one." Kincade smirked, a flicker of unease tightening his chest. "Don't matter how much you dress it up. End of the day, you're still just..." He paused, letting the silence cut deeper than words. Luther didn't blink, his voice steady, a quiet fire burning beneath it. "A black man." The words landed, stripping their pretense bare, and a jolt of discomfort shot through Kincade, his smirk faltering. Roar's jaw tensed, his fingers twitching on the wheel. "Damn right you are," he muttered, voice tight with defiance. Kincade leaned back, tapping his thigh, his heart racing with a mix of anger and uncertainty. "You walk around thinking you belong, thinking you're more than what you are." Luther tilted his head, a faint sadness in his eyes. "And what is that?" Kincade smirked, but it wavered. "A problem?" Luther exhaled, the cuffs pressing into his wrists, a dull ache mirroring the one in his soul. "You people always cry about racism, oppression," Roar said, turning onto a quieter street, his voice sharp with frustration. "But you never talk about how easy you got it now. 50 years ago, you wouldn't even be standing there." Luther let the silence stretch, a wave of weariness washing over him, then spoke, his voice cutting through their bravado with a mournful clarity. "Do you believe because the knife is 6 inches deep instead of 12, that means you're not still cutting?" Roar blinked, a flicker of confusion unsettling him. Kincade frowned, his smirk fading. "You want me to be grateful because the wound isn't as deep as it once was?" Luther continued, his tone steady, though a quiet rage trembled beneath it. "Because the hand holding the blade wears a uniform instead of a hood? Because instead of ropes, you use pens, instead of whips, laws?" His voice hardened, a deep well of pain surfacing. "You call it progress, but you've just learned to cut quietly, and now you ask why the bleeding hasn't stopped." Roar scoffed, but it sounded weak, his chest tightening with a nameless unease. "You talk a lot for someone in cuffs." Kincade smirked, though his hands shook slightly. "Keep running your mouth. We might take a detour show you how things used to be done." Luther studied them, then exhaled, a calm settling over him like armor, though his heart ached for their blindness. "Enjoy this while it lasts," he said softly, voice trembling with a quiet promise. Roar frowned, a prickle of dread creeping up his spine. "What's that supposed to mean?" Luther's gaze held a faint, sorrowful amusement. "It means you should savor these last moments. You don't yet realize what you've done." As the car stopped at the precinct, the weight of his words hung heavy. a shadow of fear neither officer could shake. The precinct buzzed with late-night routine officers sipping stale coffee, their laughter a dull hum against Luther's ears as Roor and Kincade led him inside, their smug quips grating against his resolve. Sergeant Tom O'Malley barely looked up from his paperwork, his voice flat, tinged with boredom. "What have we got?" "Vagrancy, loitering, failure to comply," Roor listed, tossing Luther's wallet onto the counter with a flick of disdain that stung Luther's pride. "Might want to run it," Kincade muttered, a smirk hiding the flicker of doubt in his chest. "Something tells me it's not real." Luther turned his head, voice smooth but firm, a quiet strength masking the weariness within. "I will be making my phone call now." O'Malley sighed, waving a hand, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Yeah, you'll get it when I say so." Luther didn't move, though a surge of defiance steadied his trembling hands. "I will be making my phone call now," he repeated, the words heavy with a resolve that made O'Malley's jaw tighten. Roor scoffed, a nervous edge to his laugh. "He thinks he's got rights." O'Malley groaned, relenting with a dismissive wave. "Whatever, let him call his damn lawyer." In the holding cell, Luther sat, hands in his lap, coat folded beside him, a faint ache in his wrists from the cuffs. He'd made his call, and now he waited, a quiet hope flickering beneath his calm. The phone had rung twice before a crisp voice answered, sharp with authority. "Alan Whitmore." Luther paused, letting recognition settle, a wave of relief softening the tension in his chest. "Alan." A sharp intake of breath came through, the rustle of fabric as the Chief Justice sat forward, alarm tightening his voice. "Luther?" Luther adjusted the receiver, voice steady though a tremor of gratitude threaded through it. "I need you to listen carefully." Silence thickened, heavy with decades of trust. "Where are you?" Whitmore's tone sharpened, a protective edge cutting through. 17th Precinct, Luther said, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the ache in his bones. "They arrested me outside the Hamilton. 2 officers, Roor and Kincade. They didn't check my ID. They didn't ask questions. They assumed I was a vagrant. I told them otherwise. They didn't listen." A pen clicked, a chair scraped, and Whitmore's voice dropped to a stunned whisper. "Jesus Christ." "No," Luther murmured, a quiet warmth in his tone. "Just me." Whitmore's breathing shifted, fury coiling beneath his control, a fierce loyalty hardening his words. "They booked you?" "Not yet," Luther said, voice soft but firm, a spark of anticipation lighting his eyes. "I suspect they'll leave me here overnight. A lesson, perhaps." A heavy silence. Then Whitmore's voice, low and lethal, trembling with barely restrained rage. "That's not going to happen." Luther's smile widened, a surge of triumph steadying his heart. That was what he'd counted on. Whitmore's unyielding resolve, forged in the same fires that had shaped him. "I'm making calls," Whitmore said, voice razor-edged, a quiet fury driving each word. "The DOJ, the AG's office hell, I might loop in the White House. Stay where you are." "I had no intention of leaving," Luther replied, a quiet joy threading through his exhaustion. The line went dead. Now, in the cell, he sat, a faint smile curving his lips, his pulse steady with the certainty of what was coming. The first phone would ring soon, and by then, the fear would belong to them. The precinct hummed with lazy energy until Claire Grant strode through the doors, her presence a sharp, electric jolt, her heels clicking with a fury that masked the terror clawing at her chest. Beside her walked Daniel Harrington, Assistant U.S. Attorney, his authority a quiet storm, his jaw tight with a cold, unyielding anger. The officer at the desk stiffened, his hands fumbling for a clipboard, a flicker of panic widening his eyes as Claire stopped short, her voice trembling with rage and love. "I want to see my grandfather." Harrington stepped forward, his tone cutting, a controlled fury simmering beneath it. "Where is Justice Grant?" The officer faltered, his breath catching, but O'Malley pushed forward, exhaling sharply, a flare of irritation masking the unease tightening his gut. "What's going on here?" Harrington turned, voice cold, each word a blade. "You're the commanding officer?" O'Malley hesitated, a bead of sweat prickling his brow. "That's right, Sergeant O'Malley, and you are?" The silence was deafening, heavy with dread. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Harrington." The room froze, a collective intake of breath as the weight of his name sank in. I'm here on behalf of the DOJ to investigate the unlawful detainment of a retired Supreme Court justice, still in your custody. O'Malley paled, his heart thudding with a sudden sickening fear. Claire snapped, her voice cracking with a raw, protective fury, tears burning her eyes. You put my grandfather in a cell like a criminal and didn't even check his ID. Harrington's gaze hardened, a quiet rage pulsing in his chest. Take me to Justice Grant, now. O'Malley turned stiffly, his steps reluctant, his breath shallow as he led them to the cell, dread sinking deeper with every echo of his boots against the concrete. Luther sat, composed, though a faint ache lingered in his wrists, a quiet pride steadying his pulse as he met Harrington's eyes with a flicker of amusement. The door swung open, and Claire stepped forward, her hands trembling, her voice strong despite the tears threatening to spill. Grandfather? Luther's gaze softened, a surge of warmth flooding his chest as he saw her strength, her love. Claire, he said, voice gentle, a quiet joy breaking through his exhaustion. Harrington turned to O'Malley, voice sharp, fury barely restrained. I want the arresting officers here, now. Captain Richard Sloan emerged from his office, pale and trembling, his hands unsteady from a call that had shattered his world, fear coiling tight in his chest. Sergeant, where are the officers who made the arrest? O'Malley fetched Roor and Kincade, their smirks fading as they stepped into the hallway, a cold dread sinking into their bones. Luther stood outside the cell, watching, a faint smile curving his lips, a quiet triumph lighting his eyes. Harrington's voice shattered the silence, raw with rage. What the hell were you thinking? His anger filled the room, a storm that made Roor flinch, his heart pounding with sudden terror. You saw an old black man outside a restaurant and threw him in a squad car without checking his ID, without due diligence, while wearing a badge. Kincade opened his mouth, a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest, but Harrington snapped, "Shut up!" His voice a whip crack of fury that silenced him instantly, fear tightening his throat. Luther spoke, voice smooth but devastating, a quiet sorrow threading through it. They didn't even run my ID. Harrington turned, incredulous, a surge of disbelief and anger darkening his eyes. You didn't check his name? Sloan suspended them on the spot, hands shaking, voice hoarse with panic. Get your things and get out. Harrington continued, his tone cold, final, a quiet satisfaction beneath his rage. Your names are with IA and the DOJ. Your careers are over. Luther stepped forward, voice steady, a deep well of resolve and grief in his words. This isn't just about them. This precinct will become a case study for systemic failure. Weeks later, at the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Whitmore met Luther, his brow furrowed, a quiet fury tightening his shoulders as he shut the file with a thud. The 17th is being ripped apart. Federal oversight begins next week. Roor and Kincade are done. Sloan's gone by week's end. Luther nodded, a quiet satisfaction steadying his pulse, though a faint ache lingered for the fight still ahead. This isn't stopping here, Whitmore said, voice heavy with resolve. It never was, Luther replied, a spark of hope lighting his weary eyes. In court, Luther testified, his voice unyielding, a quiet fire burning beneath his calm. They saw what they wanted to see. The verdict came guilty. 10 years each, no parole, heavy fines. Roor's face drained of color, terror gripping his chest. Kincade's fists clenched, his breath uneven with despair. The precinct was gutted, Sloan disgraced, and investigations spread. On the courthouse steps, Harrington declared, "This is the start of something bigger," his voice firm, a quiet triumph in his eyes. Luther watched, a steady pulse of determination driving him forward, knowing justice had moved, and tomorrow it would move again, fueled by the emotions that had carried him through the storm. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.